Hello, this is Fire, and this is part 5 of my ongoing field guide to the Vortex. This part is about the third of the aspects in alphabetical order, the aspect of destruction. So, let's get into it. The aspect of destruction is a relatively straightforward fight. That doesn't mean it's easy, it just means it's straightforward. The main themes of it is powerful multi-hits, reflect, and bleed, and also to some extent frenzy. So, once I start getting into the actual actions for aspects of destruction, I'm going to get into the weeds a bit. It is a boss that is relatively straightforward to actually fight, but it is way more complex under the hood than you might expect. So, aspect of destruction, when you start the fight, it's going to have Frenzy 1, Purity 2, and Fortress 4. So it starts with a decent amount of defense. It starts with Frenzy, and it starts with the ability to protect the Frenzy it has. And then when it gains Opportunist, which the reason I bring up Opportunist in every single aspect video is because even though Aspect of Destruction cannot naturally gain Opportunist, it can get it from the Manic Presence Weather that is active in every single Vortex fight. So you need to be aware that it can do it. And this Opportunist in particular, it's very important to know, not only is it Forex 3 damage, the buff it gains is Frenzy. And that's going to be important here in a moment once I start getting into the weeds about how this thing works. Also, on reaching 30% health, it gets Frenzy 1, Purity 2, and Invincible 1. So I'm just going to get into the weeds. Here we go. So Aspect of Destruction has two phases, for lack of a better term. Phases, forms, stances, whatever you want to call them. It's going to move back and forth between them. There is no indication visually of which stance it is in. When it starts the fight, at the very beginning of the fight, it is in phase 1 when it chooses its first action. Then it swaps to phase 2 whenever it gains Frenzy. It's going to swap back to phase 1 after it performs a phase 2 action while it doesn't have Frenzy. Noting, that's important. It is going to swap back when it performs an action from phase 2's action list that while it does not have Frenzy. This is different from saying that it swaps back to phase 1 whenever it doesn't have Frenzy. It will be in phase, so it starts phase 1, it immediately goes to phase 2 from that starting Frenzy. It's going to stay in phase 2 even if you dispel the first rank of Frenzy it has at the start of the fight. Swapping phases does not immediately change its next action, so there won't be immediate feedback when it gains Frenzy from, say, Opportunist, that it has changed stances. And that's also why, at the start of the fight, when it gains Frenzy, it is still doing the first phase 1 action because it decided to do that before it decided to gain Frenzy. Finally, or I guess that is the final point on this list. So, what are its actions? Well, I'm glad you asked. So, its first phase 1 action is deal 3x7 damage, gain powerful 2, reflect 2, 3 temporary reflect, and then shuffle in a deep wound into the player's deck. I don't have an image of a deep wound here. I realize I should. Actually, let me pause and see if I can auto-magically add one. Alright, bad news. I was unable to find a good screenshot of deep wound. So, I'll just have to explain to you. Deep wound is a blight that when you draw it, you gain bleed 2. And then when you play it, you draw a card. It just is draw 1, but if it is 2 mana to play, and if it is in your hand at end of turn, it triggers bleed the bleed on you 5 times. This is obviously a pretty obnoxious blight. It's not quite as bad as some of the others. Notably, it is not going to be as ruinous as Grasp of Shadows, which is the blight that is given to you by, for example, Aspect of Dread or Shadowbone Wisp, because unlike that one, like Deep Wound, at least you can play it and get it out of your hand. But Bleed is a pretty obnoxious debuff to pick up, and as we will go through, this is an action that the Aspect of Destruction will tend to take a lot. It loves shoveling in deep wounds. So, the next thing it's going to do after that turn is, if it is still in phase 1, which, to be clear, this is not what it's actually going to do on turn 2 normally. It's He's going to deal 3x5 damage. He's going to gain Powerful 2, Frenzy 1, Purity 2. And then, if it got to take that action, it is now in phase 2. You will not see actions 3 and 4. The only way to see actions 3 and 4 on this list, because it does them in order, is either to freeze it during that turn where it's doing the X5 hit, or to change its action with Mind Probe. If you do not do one of those two things, it is going to go to phase 2. Once it drops out of phase 2, it's going to start the phase 1 list from the top again. The third thing on the list deals 4x8 damage against Plated 4. And then the fifth thing on the list, it finally takes its turn off attacking to gain Powerful 4, Mighty 5, Critical 3, and 180 shield. It is, like I said, most of the time there's a decent chance that any given deck will not see either of these actions. If you trip Opportunist, that'll also kick it into Frenzy mode, which will kick it, back to phase 2. So the phase 2 that I've talked about has two actions here. The first is deal 4x8 area effect damage and gain Powerful 2. The second is apply Vulnerable 2, Frail 2, and Bleed 4 to the player, and increase all of those values by 1. So what's important to note is the part that I mentioned earlier, once it does one of these actions, if it does not have Frenzy, when it does the action, it will swap back to phase 1, and its next action will be the first action on the phase 1 list. So on the first turn, it's in phase 1. It's going to do, or on the first turn, the way it works is, this is roughly its normal attack cycle. It's going to start by doing that X7 attack. It's going to gain Powerful. It's going to gain Reflect. It's going to give a Deep Wound. And on the second turn, it's going to do the first phase 2 action, which is an X6 attack, and then it gains Powerful. And then it's going to swap back to phase 1. So on its third turn, it is once again going to do an X7 attack, gain Powerful and Reflect, and give a Deep Wound. It's worth noting, if you do not dispel the initial Reflect, what it's going to do is X7 attack, Powerful, Reflect, Deep Wound. Then, immediately, right after it does that, if you have not dispelled that Frenzy, it's going to do an X6 attack and gain Powerful. And on turn 2, you're going to jump straight back into doing the X7 attack, Powerful and Reflect, and a Deep Wound again. This is why I was saying this thing loves to hand out Deep Wounds. If you do not dispel that Frenzy, it will on both turns 1 and 2 give you a Deep Wound. And Deep Wounds are really obnoxious. They are, especially if you're struggling for mana, or if you don't have cleanse, it can really, really make your day worse. And it loves to give them out regularly. So, assuming though so after that second time that it gives you a Deep Wound, it will then finally move on to the second action in the phase 1 cycle, assuming you haven't tripped Opportunist. At which point it will do an X5 attack, it will gain Powerful, Frenzy, and Purity, and it's going to go back up to step 2, sort of. So I slightly miswrote this, which is that it goes back to phase 2, where it's X6 attack and gain Powerful, but if you don't dispel the Frenzy, then the second turn it takes in that cycle will be the other phase 2 action, which is apply Vulnerable 2, Frail 2, Bleed 4 to the player, increase the values by 1. So if you let it Frenzy, this gets worse, because every third turn, you're going to be hit by more and more Bleed, on top of the Deep Wound. So dispelling this Frenzy is very important, because if you dispel the Frenzy, it's only going to do the X6 attack, which is still not great for you, but a lot easier to deal with, and it won't actually apply Bleed. So, after it does that, so I mentioned it's turn 2, so it's going to do that attack. It may do the Bleed if you didn't dispel the Frenzy. Then, turn after that, which will be turn 6, because regardless of whether it has Frenzy or not, turn 5, it is going to do either only this or this and the other phase 2 action. And then turn 6, we are back to Reflect Deep Wound. Turn 7, we are on to X5 attack. Frenzy is back. Turn 8, we're back to this again. So every 3 turns, go bam, 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 repeat, bam, 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 repeat, bam, 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 and so on, and so on, and so on. You can break this cycle by freezing it, but not by dispelling it. And specifically, The important turn to freeze out if you want to break the cycle is this turn with the X5 attack, where it's gaining powerful frenzy and purity. So because you cannot see when looking at an enemy what their buffs are going to be, the way you would keep track of this is by paying attention to these numbers. The X5 attack, that's a frenzy stat. X5, frenzy. That's how that is connected. X7, reflect. The other weird note here with how this works, though, is because this X7 attack gives temporary reflect, and the thing is doing on turn 1, if you don't dispel the frenzy, it will do this again on turn 2, but on turn 1, it's going to gain 5 reflect, and then immediately on its frenzy turn, it loses all 3 of the temporary reflect, 1 of the 2 ranks of regular reflect, and when you start your second turn, it's only going to have 1 reflect left. Now, you'll have taken a heck of a beating in that time, because it will have done 3x7 damage, 21 damage, it will gain powerful 2, so then that means it's got powerful 2, so it's going to do 36 damage to you on the second turn, so you're going to take a total of 57 damage, but that's like less than a Bayonator worth of damage. It's not too bad overall, and then you won't have to deal with the reflect. So if you are a deck that is trying to do multi-hits, you may actually be better off leaving the frenzy intact, if that is a choice that you can make, and not just something where, like, due to how your cards line up, you either are hitting it or aren't. So I said I was going to get it way too into depth with this, and there you go. That is your way too detailed breakdown of how this fight goes. Another note that I kind of glossed over at the beginning: when it hits 30% health, that is the yellow bar on its health bar, it does gain invincible for a turn, which means that you won't be able to keep hitting it. It also gains frenzy and purity. So ideally, so just be aware that, like, if you're not going to be able to one-shot it, you are going to have to deal with it taking a turn. You aren't going to be able to, like, if you can take it from, like, past that bar, from like 31% health to 0 immediately, it will not get the invincible. If it takes a single card play, it doesn't have to be one hit, it has to be one card play to go from over 31% health to over 30% health to dead. You're good, and you want to deal with the invincible. But, you know, be aware, be careful. Usually I find this to be one of the easier aspects a lot of the time, because although it can do a lot of damage, it attacks in a fairly straightforward way, because as you saw, like, it is looping. If you, like, look at this list of things it's doing, like, if you can manage this reflect and you have a way to deal with the trash, then you just have to deal with the powerful stacking. You deal with relatively small base multi-hits, powerful stacking, and not that much powerful. If we're looking at this, it's like 2 powerful, 2 powerful, 2 powerful. So if you can get, like, 3 arcane detonations a turn, Aspect of Destruction is basically armless. Like, if you can come into the Aspect of Destruction fight with 3 arcane detonations every turn, then you only need about 20 shield in order to survive it. And because it's going to loop for you, the only other thing you need to be concerned about is the deep wounds. So if you can deal with the deep wounds, and you can dispel it 2 to 3 times a turn, you can keep up and you're fine. And you just have to deal with weather and whatever idols are up to. So in that regard, this is a relatively straightforward fight. Obviously, idols can make this a lot worse. The A4 idols can give a lot of powerful. If you have the misfortune of having, like, Hunt or Endurance or Hunger, give it like 8, 10 powerful on turn 1. Then you're going into turn 2 and you're looking at, like, 12x6 attack. That can be bad. But outside of idols especially, you should be fine. So that's my rough breakdown of the fight itself. Let's talk about the reward cards. So both reward cards here are actually pretty good. This is one of those cases where, like, I think that both cards are... This is similar to with Conquest, where I said, like, War Preparations is good, but I never take it. Bloody Fury is very good. I never take it, because Many Limb Strike is amazing. So Bloody Fury is 3 mana. You give any enemy bleed 10 and Berserk 1, triggers bleed 2 times. So right off the bat, the base case for this is it is 3 mana to do 30 fixed damage, which isn't that good, but it's not... In Area 6 tournament, that's not that good, but it's not, like, the worst. But if you have anything to follow this up, it does so much damage. If you've seen any bleed list ever, you know how quickly bleed can stack up, and 10 bleed is a substantial amount, even for Area 6. The upgrade is 12 bleed. The The upgrade is actually is one of those, it's weird because like it's good technically because it is a 20% increase in how much the card does, but it feels bad because like 10 to 12 feels like a relatively small bump. But the nice thing here is that means like you don't necessarily feel obligated to take this upgrade. If I still have this same aspect of adverse, this aspect of destruction, I just didn't fix. Copy paste errors are a heck of a thing. Anyway, point being, destruction will or Bloody Fury is great for outputting a lot of damage. You're playing a deck that can abuse bleed. If this is your first aspect and your next aspect is Conquest, and you have a way to clear out the purity that is given by the Cleric Doggo, then Bloody Fury can be great as your way to kill back Conquest dogs, especially if you otherwise don't have a way to do that. Especially because Many Limb Strike is often not going to be great into Conquest due to how that fight is set up. So, strongly consider the card, at least. The other one is Many Limb Strike, which is 0 cost strike, deal 3x8 damage to the first enemy. If this dealt 100 or more damage, gain Frenzy 1 and Fatigue 1. It's one of those cards I think if you take it, you are going to upgrade it, because the upgrade is 3x10 damage, which means you get 2 more hits to get to 100. And it is not that, if you are in Area 4, you probably will not have problems getting Many Limb Strike up to 100 damage. That's just a thing you are expecting to be, like, if you are expecting to be able to do enough damage to deal with Area 4 enemies, you probably have a plan that will give you what you need to push Many Limb Strike to 100 damage. Because that's only 10 damage, that's only like 7 ranks of powerful, or like a couple less ranks powerful and some other bonuses. And then the fact that this is a 0 mana card that gives you Frenzy and Fatigue is incredibly strong. The card Frenzied Rage, which is the generic card that's 3 mana to get Frenzy 1 and Fatigue 1, is getting nerfed in the next patch because it was too strong. And Many Limb Strike is, in many cases, better than Frenzied Rage, both because it's lower cost and because the fact that it does damage is very relevant. If it dealt 100 more damage, this is often a card that's going to be dealing in a powerful stacking deck is going to be dealing 200, 300, even more damage. And that can help. That makes it very, very good, both as a way to give you extra turns, which is always valuable, and as a way to just chunk through enemy health so that you can end fights. So for that reason, I tend to value Many Limb Strike a lot more than Bloody Fury. But both cards are fantastic, and both cards can do amazing work in the right deck. So this is one of those fights where I have mentioned before that in general, the aspect reward cards are so good that, or at least one of the two will be so good that it is the card that you want, because it will give you that last little bit of power that you need going into the other aspect fight or into the Mudrara fight. So I tend to like to take one of the two, and this is no exception, and these two in particular are some of the stronger ones, and I absolutely would recommend considering them. And if you have not tried them and you are kind of on the fence, you're not really sold, at least give them a shot, and I think you'll be impressed. So that is it for part 5 of my field guide to the Vortex, the aspect of destruction. The next part will be the aspect of dread, and that will be, again, tomorrow. Until then, toodles.